ChatGPT said under the ashen skies of that long-forgotten Sunday in 1878, when the air itself felt heavy with unspoken omens, Cedar Hollow's small white church stood like a sentinel of false salvation at the edge of the woods. Its steeple clawed at the heavens, as if desperate to pierce through the veil that separates the living from the damned. The congregation arrived early, their boots crunching on frost-stiffened earth, voices low as though afraid to disturb something slumbering just beyond sight. Inside, the air was thick with the mingled scents of burning oil lamps and damp wool, but beneath it lay another scent, fainter yet undeniable. Iron, earth, and something sour, like a grave left open too long. The preacher, Reverend Elias Crow, was a man whose voice could strip away the pretense of peace and leave only the raw nerve of the soul exposed. That morning, however, his eyes seemed fixed not on the congregation, but on something only he could see, something over their heads, behind their shoulders, lurking just out of reach. He spoke of sin, but his words felt less like warnings and more like sentences already passed, each syllable dragging like chains across the floorboards of the mind. As he spoke, the wind outside began to howl, rattling the windows in their frames, though the trees beyond the glass did not move. The children sat in the front pews, hands folded, eyes wide, yet their stillness was unnatural, as if some unspoken command had hollowed out the usual restlessness of youth. At the final hymn, the Reverend's voice swelled into something almost inhuman. Deep, resonant, shaking the rafters, and then it stopped, cut clean, leaving the silence behind like a predator's shadow. No one rose, no one turned toward the doors. Those waiting outside, the ones who had not joined the service, would later speak of how the air turned icy in an instant, how the sound of the hymn bled away into a silence so vast it seemed to swallow the world. When the doors finally swung inward hours later, there was nothing inside but the echo of footsteps that no longer belonged to anyone, and a faint lingering scent of smoke and blood that no wind could carry away. Cedar Hollow never held another service. The church still stands, sagging into itself, its windows black and unreflective, its doors shut as though nailed by unseen hands, and those who pass by swear that if you stop and listen, you can still hear the last notes of the hymn, sung by voices that no longer draw breath. By the time the sun had climbed high enough to burn the morning fog from the valley, Cedar Hollow lay still, as though the earth itself held its breath. The church, once the heart of the town's fragile faith, stood like a monument to something older and more merciless than God, its weathered timbers groaning in the August heat. Parents had begun to gather near its heavy oak doors, their faces tense, their eyes scanning the dirt road for any sign of the children who had gone inside hours earlier. The bell, which should have rung at the end of Sunday school, was silent, and in that silence something unnatural seemed to grow, an invisible pressure that made men's jaws tighten and women clutch their shawls tighter around their shoulders. It was Elias Marrow, the blacksmith, who first tested the latch, finding it unmoving beneath his calloused grip. Others joined him, pounding, shouting, their voices colliding in panic, but no sound came from within, not the shuffle of feet, not the echo of a hymn, not even a single cry. The Reverend Jonah Crail was nowhere to be seen, though his horse still stood tethered in the side yard, stamping and snorting as though it sensed the same unseen wrongness that now crept into every corner of Cedar Hollow. Some claimed to see shapes moving in the windows, fleeting and too quick to name, while others swore the glass had gone darker, as though the daylight refused to pass through. Elias fetched his iron bar and began to pry at the lock, the sound of splintering wood sharp and desperate in the charged air. When the door finally gave way, it did so with a suddenness that startled them all, yet revealed nothing. The room beyond was empty. Pews sat in perfect order. The altar cloth was undisturbed, but the children, every single one of them, were gone. There were no dropped hymnals, no scattered shoes, no overturned benches. It was as though they had been lifted from the earth without a single trace. The smell inside was wrong, sweet, cloying, and almost metallic. And in the far corner of the sanctuary, where shadows clung unnaturally thick, something glistened faintly, a small dark pool seeping into the floorboards. Someone whispered a prayer. Someone else whispered a curse. And outside, high above the steeple, a black shape circled in the sky, moving too slow and too deliberate to be a bird. Under the weight of a grey and swollen sky, the bell of St. Aurelius tolled once, deep, resonant and hollow, rolling across the hills like a summons from the grave, and the townsfolk of Brackenford moved toward the church as though pulled by an unseen chain. They came in their Sunday best, the black lacquer of boots polished to a mirror's sheen, collars starched until they cut, and yet no one's eyes met another's, for every gaze seemed drawn upward to the belfry where, they swore, something moved in the shadows just beyond sight. The children skipped along the cobbles at first, laughter bubbling against the damp, but the closer they came to the heavy oaken doors, the quieter they grew until silence pressed down like a damp cloth over a mouth, muting every step, every breath, until even the restless shifting of feet sounded like thunder in the mind. The Reverend Malachi Draven waited within, a figure gaunt as famine, the thin skin of his hands drawn tight over bone, his eyes sunk deep into hollows as though they gazed inward to some darkness that none dared name. And though his voice was calm when he greeted each soul, there was a cadence beneath the words, a slow and serpentine rhythm that made the hair on the nape rise and the heart falter in its beat. Candles guttered in the nave, though no wind moved, their light a pale and sickly gold that seemed to crawl rather than flicker. And as the congregation filed inside, the air thickened with the scent of tallow and incense, yet beneath it lay a faint metallic tang, like blood on a coin, though none dared acknowledge it. One by one the pews filled, children nestled between parents, hands clasped as if for prayer, yet more as if for tethering, until the last to enter was a girl of no more than 8, her hair the color of wheat at dusk, and when she crossed the threshold, the doors boomed shut of their own accord, the sound echoing like the fall of a great stone into a well, and in that instant the bell above struck again, though none had seen the rope move, and a shiver passed through every soul present, for in the deep stillness that followed, all could feel it, that the world beyond the church had been cut away, as though the walls themselves had grown roots into the earth, sealing them inside with whatever waited in the shadowed heart of St. Aurelius. The weeks that followed were shrouded in a gloom that clung to Cedar Hollow like a burial shroud, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken fear and unanswered questions, the kind of fear that seeped into bone and marrow, making even the strongest men glance over their shoulders and bolt their doors before the sun had fully dipped below the tree line. No one could quite explain what had happened that Sunday morning, but the whispers painted pictures darker than any truth. Stories of shadowed figures in the churchyard before dawn, of a strange metallic scent on the wind, of an unnatural stillness that fell over the valley moments before the service began, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Mothers sat at kitchen tables with hands curled around cold teacups, their eyes hollow and red-rimmed from nights without sleep, staring at the empty chairs where their children should have been. Fathers took to patrolling the roads with shotguns, though they knew, deep down, that whatever had taken the congregation was not a thing to be met with powder and lead. The preacher's home stood empty, its windows black and unblinking, though some swore they had seen movement inside. Slow, deliberate shapes that did not match the living. The sheriff, a man who had once believed that every mystery had a man-made cause, now avoided the church road entirely, for even in daylight it seemed wrong, its silence heavier than stone, the bell tower leaning just enough to look as though it were listening. At night, strange sounds began to bleed from the hollow, low, mournful tones like a hymn sung backward, or the faint echo of children's voices calling names no one in the town recognized. Animals grew skittish, refusing to graze near the churchyard, and more than once a farmer would find his livestock huddled at the far edge of their fields, their eyes rolling white in terror. The old midwy, Fee, who claimed to know things older than Scripture, told anyone who would listen that the ground beneath that church had been cursed long before the first nail was driven into its frame, that the missing had not been taken but swallowed, and that in time Cedar Hollow itself might follow. And though no one wanted to believe her, no one could shake the feeling that the hollow was watching them, waiting for the right moment to take again. The bells of St. Aldrich's tolled that morning with a voice that seemed older than the stones themselves, their iron tongues calling the faithful from miles around, summoning them into the cavernous nave where incense clung like ghost breath in the rafters. Mothers pressed their children's hands into the font, fathers stood like sentinels in the back pews, and the priest, Father Malric, moved with a deliberate slowness as though each step through the aisle weighed 1,000 years. Outside, the sky was unnaturally still, clouds hanging heavy like a lid over the earth, and though it was midsummer, the air carried a chill that raised goose-flesh along the arms of every soul who crossed the threshold. The great wooden doors closed with a sound like the lid of a coffin, and those passing by later would say they never heard them open again. Within, the candles flickered in unison, as if responding to a breath no living creature had drawn. The first hymn was sung, voices swelling and echoing against the stone. But it was during the second that the sound began to warp, notes bending downward into something hollow, discordant, until the music seemed less like praise and more like lamentation. Some in the pews claimed the scent of incense turned acrid, like burning hair, and that the stained glass figures in the windows were no longer gazing outward toward the light, but inward toward the congregation, eyes narrowing as if judging. Malric's voice deepened, not in tone alone, but in presence, carrying a weight that pressed upon the chests of those listening. His words were in Latin, yes, but not the Latin of Rome, something older, harsher, each syllable scraping at the mind as though it had been dragged up from beneath centuries of soil. A child began to cry, but was quickly shushed, though the sound seemed to hang unnaturally long in the vaulted ceiling. Then, as the last note of Te, hymn died, an oppressive silence fell, not the stillness of peace, but the kind that hums in the bones, the kind that precedes a storm. Those outside on the road later swore they saw the church windows blacken all at once, as though the sun itself had been barred from entry, and in that instant the sound of the bells began again, but now they rang without hands to pull the ropes, their toll uneven and maddened, echoing far across the valley. No one who entered after that moment found a single soul inside. By the winter of that same year, Cedar Hollow was no longer merely a village. It had become a wound in the earth, a place where the air carried whispers that scraped at the mind. The church still stood, its wooden frame groaning in the wind, its steeple like a crooked finger pointing toward a heaven that seemed to have turned its face away. Snow fell heavier here than anywhere else in the county, as though the sky was trying to bury what had happened, yet no snowfall could silence the creak of the doors that sometimes swung open on their own, revealing only darkness inside. People who dared to pass by swore they heard the faint echo of a hymn, the melody warped and mournful, sung by voices too young and too far away to be real. The Reverend, now stripped of title and dignity, was said to wander the woods at night, muttering to himself, clutching a book bound in something that was not leather. His eyes, when seen, were described as glassy and unblinking, reflecting no light. Livestock began to vanish, then pets, then disturbingly children from neighboring towns. None were ever found, and each disappearance was followed by the same sight. Crows gathering on the church roof in unnatural numbers, their beaks tapping the shingles in a rhythm too precise to be chance. Stories spread that the ground beneath Cedar Hollow was not ground at all, but a thin crust over something alive, something hungry, and that the children had not been buried but taken below. The county sheriff tried to burn the church down, but the flames would not hold, as if the wood itself rejected fire. Men who volunteered to dismantle it fell ill within hours, their bodies racked with fever and visions of faces staring at them from the pews. Soon, no one entered Cedar Hollow willingly, and maps began to omit its name, as if the land itself was erasing the memory. But in the depth of night, on certain winds, in the faint sound of a bell could still be heard, 3 slow tolls, followed by the dragging scrape of something heavy moving across the church floor. Those who heard it knew what it meant. The doors had closed again, and somewhere someone was not coming back. The villagers whispered that the curse had begun the night the storm shattered the steeple's iron cross, a jagged lightning strike that cleaved the air like the blade of an executioner. The priest at that time, Father Malric, had been seen in the graveyard hours before, kneeling not before the crucifix, but at the oldest headstone in Cedar Hollow, one so weather-worn its name had been lost to time. Some swore they saw him press his hands into the soil as if feeling for a pulse beneath, his lips moving in a language no one recognized. After that night, the church doors were sealed without explanation, yet the candles inside never seemed to burn out. Windows glowed faintly at all hours, though no one entered or exited. Livestock began to vanish from their pens without sign of struggle, found days later drained of blood, their eyes wide open as though they had glimpsed something no living creature should. Children woke screaming from nightmares of shadowed figures chanting in the nave, voices in unison but coming from every corner of the room. The sheriff, a practical man named Darnell before the name was erased from memory, attempted to force the doors open. The hinges groaned but held firm, and when he peered through the crack between them, his hair turned white overnight. He would never speak of what he saw, only muttering scripture under his breath until he took his own life in the autumn of that year. It was then the graveyard grew restless, stones cracked, names bled away from their carvings, and fresh soil shifted over graves decades old. One by one, the villagers stopped passing the church at night, making detours through bramble and marsh rather than walk under its shadow. But even avoidance proved futile, for the curse seeped outward like mist, creeping into dreams, curling into the marrow of those who dared to deny it. And when the bells began to toll at midnight, their sound was no longer metal striking metal, but something deeper, like a heart pounding inside the hollow chest of the earth. Each chime seemed to draw something nearer, something the elders refused to name, for naming gives power, and power in Cedar Hollow had long since passed from God to something else entirely. The first storm came without warning, a bruised sky rolling in from the hills, carrying a wind that sounded like the groan of something ancient and displeased. Rain lashed at the windows of St. Bartholomew's until the old glass rattled in their frames, and the bell rope swayed gently without a hand upon it. Inside, the air thickened, heavy with the smell of wet stone and extinguished candles. The parishioners whispered that the heavens were expressing their displeasure, but the truth was darker. Father Calder watched from the chancel, his eyes fixed not on the storm outside, but on the shadow pooling at the farthest corner of the nave, a shadow that was not shaped by any earthly light. No matter how the lightning flared, it remained untouched by illumination, its edges sharp and deliberate, as if drawn with purpose. That night, the church organ exhaled a note on its own, a low, resonant sound that made the floor tremble underfoot. It was followed by the faint scrape of wood on stone, as if a pew had shifted, though no soul had moved. The following morning they found the sanctuary door bolted from the inside, though Calder swore he had left it open. On the altar lay a single black feather, damp and curved as though plucked from something that had flown through the downpour. The villagers spoke of the Black Herald, a figure from the oldest hilltop tales, the one who walks before calamity with feathers that smell of rain and decay. Calder knew the legend well. His grandmother had whispered it over the embers of their hearth when he was a boy, telling him that the herald did not come to warn but to collect. That week the storms did not relent. Each night brought another unnatural sign, a hymn sung by unseen voices, the taste of iron in the drinking water, the faint echo of boots pacing the upper gallery, though it had been locked for years. By the fifth night, even the Mostant devout stopped attending Vespers. Only Calder remained, sitting in the front pew long after the candles guttered out, listening to the slow creak of the church settling into its own unnatural stillness. When the sixth storm arrived, it brought no thunder, no lightning, only a thick, suffocating fog that pressed against the stained glass like a living thing, and for the first time, Calder thought he saw the shadow in the nave extend an arm toward him. The silence that followed was not the stillness of peace, but the suffocating quiet of something watching, waiting, measuring the breath and heartbeat of every soul still lingering outside the church. The sun was dimmed now, not by cloud but by a strange pall that seemed to seep from the very wood and stone of the building, as though it exhaled centuries of sorrow and hunger into the air. Reverend Ashworth's voice could be heard faintly still, a low and unbroken chant in some language no one in Cedar Hollow recognized, his tone neither joyous nor mournful, but unyielding, mechanical, and laced with something that felt older than scripture. The faces of those who had dared remain grew ashen, eyes darting to the shut doors as if expecting them to burst open at any moment, though none truly wanted that. They said later it was in that hour the birds vanished from the trees and the creek's current slowed to a crawl, as though the entire valley was holding its breath. Old Mrs. Halpern clutched her rosary so tight her knuckles bled, whispering to herself that she had heard such a sound once before in the summer of '43, the night her own sister disappeared in the mines. How the air then had the same weight, the same taste of iron and dust, the same sense of a shadow leaning over the world. Nobody listened. Nobody could afford to listen. The problem was not that the doors were closed, it was that those inside had stopped being people the moment they crossed the threshold. Every sensible soul had already fled down the ridge, but those who stayed felt themselves pressed into the earth by an invisible hand, unable to look away from that black maw of a doorway, from the flicker of candlelight that danced unnaturally along the warped glass, casting shapes that did not match the human form. They did not know if it was minutes or hours before the chanting slowed, deepened, and shifted into something like a single drawn-out breath, too long for any mortal lungs. The creak seemed to stop altogether, and then, just for an instant, the heavy oak doors shivered as if struck from the inside, a sound like every knuckle in a giant's hand cracking at once. Those who heard it would never forget it, for it was the sound not of something trying to escape, but of something settling in, preparing to stay. The winter that followed was unlike any Cedar Hollow had ever known, a season so long and unrelenting it seemed as if the sun itself had abandoned the valley, leaving only a sky of iron and a wind that whispered of graves. Snow piled high against the sagging porches of abandoned cabins, burying them halfway to the roofline, and the creek froze so solid that even the wild dogs could cross without breaking the glassy surface. The townsfolk who remained wrapped themselves in blankets and silence, keeping to the flickering light of their hearths as if the fire could ward off not just the cold, but the heavy, invisible thing pressing against the town. Men stopped going into the woods for timber, for too many had gone and not returned, their trails ending abruptly in the drifts with no sign of struggle, as though they had simply been plucked from the earth. Livestock vanished from locked barns, their hoof prints ending in strange circular depressions in the snow, and children began speaking of a tall, thin man in a black hat standing at the edge of the forest, watching with a stillness that made their voices quiver. The pastor, desperate to keep the fear from swallowing his congregation whole, declared a night of prayer in the old church, urging all to come and seek the Lord's protection. But when that night came, only half the town gathered, and before the prayers could rise to the rafters, the oil lamps sputtered out, plunging the sanctuary into a darkness so thick it seemed to muffle even breath. In that suffocating black, a sound began, a low, deliberate tapping as though fingernails were brushing along the wooden walls, moving from one side of the building to the other. It circled them slowly, methodically, until the pastor's voice broke mid-verse and silence fell like a dropped shroud. Then, without warning, the doors at the back creaked open, letting in a gust of wind, so bitter it made every candle die at once. The space beyond was not white with snow as they expected, but black, a depthless, churning dark that smelled faintly of wet earth. Something moved within it, not rushing, not lunging, but approaching with the patience of something that had waited far longer than they had lived. No one saw a face, no one heard a word, yet they knew, deep and certain, that the thing outside the door had been there long before Cedar Hollow was built, and that winter would not end until it had taken what it had come for. By the time the authorities officially intervened, the church had become an object of both morbid curiosity and hushed terror, drawing townsfolk who lingered just far enough away to feel safe but close enough to witness the unfolding strangeness. Police lights flashed against the ancient stone, bathing the carvings of saints and angels in a sinister red-blue glow, yet not a single soul emerged from within. The main entrance was chained from the inside, an impossibility considering no one had been seen leaving, and the stained glass windows pulsed faintly as though candlelight danced behind them despite the church's electricity having been cut years ago. Officers attempted to force the doors, but their tools bent or shattered as if the oak had turned to some unnatural metal, unyielding to human strength. Witnesses claimed they could hear muffled singing, deep and resonant, a choir not of this century, voices weaving together in a melody that carried no words, only a strange vibration that settled into the chest and stirred feelings of dread. One officer swore the sound spoke to him, not in a language, but in an understanding, an invitation he refused to accept. When a ladder was raised to a side window, the man who climbed it froze halfway, his body stiff, eyes wide, and without a word he descended, shaking uncontrollably, refusing to say what he had seen. The air around the church grew unnaturally still, not a leaf stirred, and though it was the middle of summer, a visible mist began to coil upward from beneath the heavy wooden doors, carrying with it a smell that no one could name but everyone instinctively recoiled from. A priest from a neighboring town arrived at the scene, clutching an ornate cross and a worn leather Bible, his hands trembling not from age but from something unseen. He spoke briefly with the police, then without hesitation approached the door and pressed the cross against it. The singing stopped instantly. The silence that followed was heavier than sound, a pressure that made ears pop and vision blur. Then from somewhere deep inside the church, a single deliberate knock echoed, slow, final, and impossibly loud. Those gathered swore it was not a call for help, but an announcement, a signal that whatever had begun inside those walls was now aware of the world outside and had no intention of letting go. The night deepened, and with it the manor seemed to grow heavier, as though the air itself was thick with secrets long suppressed. The corridors stretched unnaturally, their shadows curling like smoke, as if the house was bending reality to keep its prisoners, whether living or dead, trapped inside. Clara moved slowly now, no longer rushing, because she realized that speed meant little here. The halls shifted regardless of her pace. Her fingers traced the edges of the wallpaper, feeling the roughness of age until they found something peculiar, a thin seam running vertically in the wall. Pressing against it, she felt it give slightly, and a cold draught whispered through, carrying the scent of damp stone and something faintly metallic, like old blood. She pushed harder, and the wall opened just enough for her to slip inside. The space beyond was narrow and suffocating, a hidden staircase spiraling downward into darkness. Each step groaned under her weight, and the air grew colder with every descent. At the bottom she found herself in a small stone chamber, lit by a single flickering lantern that hung from a rusted chain. In the center of the room sat a massive wooden table covered in brittle yellowed papers and strange instruments, rusted calipers, glass vials clouded with residue, and a heavy ledger bound in cracked leather. She opened the ledger, and her breath caught. Every page was filled with names, dates, and meticulously drawn diagrams of the human body, marked with surgical cuts and annotations in a language she didn't recognize. But it wasn't just medical, it was ritualistic. Some diagrams showed symbols carved into the flesh, while others had notations about moon phases and planetary alignments. As she turned the pages, she found one that stopped her heart. Her own name, written in the same precise script, followed by a date. Today's date. A shadow moved across hers. He wall, though she was alone, and the lantern's light dimmed as if suffocated by something unseen. She slammed the ledger shut, but the air seemed to pulse, a low, steady beat like a heartbeat, resonating through the stone floor and into her bones. Something was awake now, aware of her presence, and it was drawing closer, slow and deliberate, like a predator savoring the hunt. The old manor's heart beat slower now, as if conserving its last breath before revealing the deepest of its secrets. The wind outside howled with a voice that was almost human, a guttural moan that seemed to echo the grief buried in the Grimsbane legacy. Elias sat at the oak desk in the library, his fingers brushing against the brittle pages of the blackened ledger he had found in the hidden compartment of the desk drawer. The ink was faded, but the words were still legible, entries made by his great-grandfather, Mortimer Grimsbane, each one a confession of deeds so vile they seemed impossible to believe. There were mentions of a secret chamber beneath the estate, a place referred to only as the Hollow of Faces, where the family would gather under moonless nights to conduct rites older than the village itself. These rituals, according to Mortimer, required not just offerings of gold or grain, but of life. Blood spilled to ensure the family's prosperity and survival through every famine, every plague, every war. Elias's stomach churned as he read of the disappearances in the village during the winters of 1834 and 1837, each accounted for in the ledger as a gift to the Hollow. Yet it wasn't just strangers or enemies listed. There were family members too, cousins and even siblings who had served the greater will when times demanded it. The last entry was dated the night Mortimer himself vanished, marked with a single line of crimson ink. The hollow takes what it is owed. The fireplace crackled behind him, casting long shadows across the bookshelves, but Elias noticed something strange. Every shadow seemed to lean toward him, as if drawn to the words he was reading. The air in the room grew colder, and from somewhere deep below the floor, a faint sound began to rise. It was not the creak of old wood, nor the settling of stone, but a rhythmic, muffled chant, the kind hat worms into the mind and refuses to let go. The ledger's last page began to feel warm under his fingertips, the ink seeming to shimmer faintly as though freshly spilled. He could feel the weight of generations pressing on him, urging him toward a decision he could neither accept nor reject. Somewhere beneath his feet, the hollow was waking, and it knew his name. The storm finally broke in the dead of night, slamming against the manor with a force that made the ancient timbers groan like the final breath of a dying thing. In the uppermost chamber, the old clock struck 3, each chime lingering unnaturally long, as though the sound itself was reluctant to leave. In that moment, a shadow detached itself from the corner of the room, a shape more absence than presence, gliding toward the heavy oak desk where the family's most forbidden ledger lay open. The pages turned on their own, revealing ink that shimmered faintly, as though written with something far more visceral than ink. Downstairs, the great hall's portraits seemed to watch with renewed attention, their painted eyes glinting faintly, betraying a flicker of something almost alive. The air in the house grew thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something acrid, like burnt offerings. No footsteps echoed, yet the sensation of movement filled every hallway, and in the silence between gusts of wind, faint whispers threaded through the air, each syllable sliding into the mind without passing through the ears. The whispers carried warnings, names, and dates, none from the living. In the east wing, the grand mirror, an heirloom older than the country itself, began to tarnish from the edges inward, blackening like paper touched by flame. In its warped glass, fleeting images emerged, faceless figures at a banquet table, their hands clasped, a chalice in the center filled with something that pulsed faintly as if alive. The figure in the upper chamber lingered over the ledger, one long finger tracing the names in a slow, deliberate motion, pausing over one in particular, a name not recorded in any official family history. Outside, lightning split the sky, revealing for the briefest moment a gathering of cloaked silhouettes in the courtyard below, their faces hidden, their attention fixed on the same window where the shadow stood. And in the space between lightning and thunder, the manor seemed to exhale, its ancient stones resonating with the low hum of something awakening after centuries of patience. Through the centuries, the Grimsbane name became a whispered curse, a shadow cast over every village, every estate, every deal they touched. Their lineage was soaked in scandal, their fortune built on ruin and blood. But the deeper you look, the more it becomes clear. It wasn't just greed or cruelty driving them. It was something older, something woven into their very bloodline. Records from the 1500s show the first hints. Unexplained disappearances near their lands, strange symbols carved into stone gates, and family members who seemed to defy age while their rivals withered away. The church tried to intervene once, sending an inquisition to cleanse their estate, but every investigator either vanished or returned months later with no memory of what happened inside. By the 1700s, the Grimsbanes weren't merely wealthy landowners. They were power brokers in a shadow economy, making decisions that shaped kingdoms while never appearing in official history. They were untouchable, not because of gold, but because anyone who crossed them seemed to meet a fate too bizarre to be called coincidence. Letters between European nobles suggest even monarchs feared invoking their wrath, and yet through all of this there was always one strange constant, a single sealed chamber in the heart of their ancestral manor, passed down from heir to heir, never opened in living memory. Local legends claim it holds the original debt that binds the family to their power, something so dangerous it cannot see the light of day. But in 1894, a drunken footman claimed he heard chanting behind that chamber door, low, rhythmic, in a language that made his skin crawl. The next morning he was found hanging from the old willow by the gate, his eyes wide open as if frozen in terror. The coroner's report vanished before it could be filed. People say the Grimsbane's true wealth isn't gold, but influence, whispers that bend markets, wars, and even faith itself. And if you trace the world's most inexplicable tragedies from collapsed empires to sudden assassinations, you'll find their hand somewhere in the shadows. To this day, the manor stands silent, its gates rusted shut, the sealed chamber still locked, but the curse of the Grimsbanes doesn't need walls or windows. It travels in blood, in promises sealed generations ago, and as history has shown, debts that old are never forgiven, only collected. The storm broke over Blackthorn Hall like an ancient curse clawing its way back to the surface. The rain came in sheets, battering the cracked stone walls as if trying to peel away centuries of lies. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with the scent of mold, rotting wood, and something far older, something that seemed to hum in the bones. Ezra Blackthorn stood at the top of the grand staircase, the dim light from the chandelier swaying above, casting jagged shadows across his face. His eyes were fixed on the great hall below, where the family had gathered, drawn not by choice but by compulsion, each of them clutching the envelope that had arrived 3 nights ago. No one spoke, but the silence was not the kind born of unease. It was the kind that swells before a confession, before something irreversible is uttered into the air. A log cracked in the massive hearth, sending a burst of embers into the gloom. Behind Ezra, the portrait of Lord Alistair Blackthorn seemed almost to smirk, the painted eyes glistening as if wet. The letters had summoned them with a single line. The debt must be paid in blood. The fire's glow caught on the edges of the ancient seal, the serpent devouring its own tail, burned into the wax. Outside, the wind wailed through the broken windows of the west wing, carrying with it a faint whisper that seemed to circle the room, brushing against each ear. Ezra's grip tightened on the railing. He knew this night would strip away everything, titles, fortunes, illusions, and leave only the raw truth of what the Blackthorn name had been built upon. Somewhere in the depths of the hall, the old clock began to chime, but the sound was wrong, hollow, offbeat. As the final chime echoed through the house, the heavy oak doors at the far end creaked open on their own. No one dared to turn their head. They all knew who was coming, and worse, they all knew why. The investigation into the Grimsbane estate took a darker turn when archivists unearthed a set of journals hidden in the rotting beams of the east wing, each volume bound in cracked leather and smelling faintly of mildew and something far less natural. The pages, written in a spidery hand, chronicled not just daily affairs, but a meticulous record of rituals, invocations, and calculated manipulations of local power that stretched back centuries. These weren't the ramblings of a superstitious mind. They read like a ledger of influence, a careful account of debt and obedience extracted from those who had crossed the family's path. Villagers whispered that these books were never meant to be found, that their words were inked in more than just pigment, and that simply reading them was an invitation to be watched by something unseen. As investigators traced the entries, they found that the names and dates corresponded disturbingly well with disappearances, bankruptcies, and unexplained deaths that had plagued the region over generations. But the most chilling discovery came when one of the team, against strict orders, read an incantation aloud. In the days that followed, the man became increasingly erratic, claiming he could hear footsteps pacing outside his window each night at precisely 3:11 a.m. The pacing would stop the moment he approached the glass, yet the prints of bare, elongated feet appeared in the frost. His decline was rapid. By the end of the week he had vanished, leaving behind only his notepad, open to a page scrawled with a single sentence, "They've remembered my name." What struck the lead historian most wasn't the content itself, but the deliberate precision of the Grimsbane family's methods. Each ritual in the journals was designed not for immediate gain, but for slow, generational corrosion of will and independence, ensuring loyalty could never be revoked, end by death. It became increasingly clear that the Grimsbanes had not just ruled their domain, they had embedded themselves into the psychology of the land and its people, becoming an unavoidable presence in the collective memory. Locals refused to speak of them in the present tense, as if acknowledging the family's end would be a dangerous kind of lie. And perhaps it was, because every so often, a light still flickered in the manor's highest window. though no one had lived there for decades. The townsfolk began to notice the strange changes in the air around the Grimsbane estate, though few dared to speak of it openly. There was a constant low hum, like the vibration of a giant unseen machine that seemed to seep from the ground and rattle through the bones of anyone who passed too close. At night, pale light bled from the cracks of the boarded windows, shifting in unnatural colors that seemed to pulse with a rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. Those who ventured near swore they could hear voices, not shouting, not whispering, but something between, a layered chorus of tones that didn't seem human. The family themselves were rarely seen, but when they appeared, their movements seemed too deliberate, their eyes glassy, as if they were listening to instructions no one else could hear. More unsettling still was the gradual disappearance of small animals from the area, cats, dogs, even livestock, always vanishing without a trace, as if erased from existence. The local priest claimed the family had been dabbling in forbidden rites, drawing power from something older than the town, older than the land itself. Some nights a thick fog would roll in from nowhere, smothering the fields in silence so heavy it felt like the world had been paused. Inside that fog, shapes moved, tall, thin silhouettes that lingered at the edge of sight. No one could explain the strange burns that appeared on fence posts and door frames after these nights, small circular marks in patterns that looked almost like constellations. The Grimsbanes, for their part, never acknowledged any of it. They carried on their routines with a grim precision, as if working toward an end only they understood. And yet, the estate's boundaries seemed to creep outward with each passing month. Old maps no longer matched the land. Paths and hedgerows had shifted subtly until the property seemed to stretch far beyond and what it should. It was as if the very geography was bending to their will. Rumors began to spread that the family had found a way to change not just the land but the minds of those who approached it. Travelers would walk in, confused, and emerge hours later with no memory of what they'd done or seen. Some never came back at all. The most frightening whispers claimed that the Grimsbanes weren't just using the town. They were reshaping it, remaking it into something that served a purpose no outsider could comprehend, and that soon no one would be able to leave. The deeper I dug, the more the pattern emerged, a thread that wound its way through centuries, binding the Grimsbane family to events so catastrophic they seemed almost orchestrated. Fires that consumed entire villages, plagues that erupted without warning, ships that vanished with all hands aboard. At first glance they appeared to be coincidences, but the family's name was always lurking at the periphery, like a shadow in the corner of the frame. There were letters, faded, brittle with age, written in a language that modern scholars couldn't fully decipher, their margins filled with intricate diagrams of geometric shapes and blood-red annotations. In the family's archives, I found pages describing the binding, a ritual said to secure influence over minds and markets alike at the cost of an unnamed inheritance. That phrase chilled me, because alongside it were lists, names, dates of birth, and abrupt, unexplained dates of death. It was as though each generation had paid a toll in human lives to maintain their grasp on power. The Grimsbanes never built their fortune in the light of day. It was amassed in backrooms and blood oath gatherings, traded in whispers among monarchs, warlords, and shadow councils. One recurring figure kept appearing in paintings, daguerreotypes, and early photographs, a man with a lean, angular face and eyes that seemed to follow you no matter where you stood. The unnerving part was that the earliest image of him was from the late 1600s, and the most recent was from 1924. His clothes changed with the fashion of the times, but his face, his features were untouched by age. Locals called him the steward, though some insisted he was no servant, but rather the true hand guiding the family's every move, from wars funded to treaties broken. The deeper the family descended into secrecy, the less they were seen in public. By the late 19th century, the P.A. were ghosts in their own ancestral estate, emerging only for funerals which were always conducted at midnight with no clergy present. I found one account from a gardener who claimed that during one such funeral the coffin was empty, yet the mourners wept as though they had buried something more vital than flesh. The more I read, the more I realized this wasn't simply a family guarding its wealth. It was a dynasty safeguarding a covenant, one sealed long before any of them were born, and perhaps impossible to break without unleashing whatever it was they had kept chained in the dark. The air in Ravenshade was heavy, not with the mist that often rolled in from the marshes, but with the unshakable weight of something watching, always watching. The few villagers who remained spoke in half-whispers, eyes darting toward the northern hills where the ruins of the Grimsbane estate still brooded against the sky. Local lore said the house was built on the bones of a pre-Christian burial ground, but the truth, whispered among elders, was that it stood atop something older and far less human. The Grimsbane family, in their centuries-long thirst for control, were said to have bound themselves in blood oaths to entities that no church dared name, in exchange for unbroken influence and unnatural longevity. But power like that demands payment, and the price was never gold. By the late 1800s, when the last patriarch, Mortivus Grimsbane, walked the halls, the land itself had begun to sour. Crops rotted in the fields, livestock were found drained of blood, and people vanished without trace. Mortivus, a man whose eyes were so pale they seemed almost blind, claimed the disappearances were the work of wolves. Yet there had not been a single wolf sighted in Ravenshade for decades. It was said that during the dark of the moon, strange chants echoed from deep beneath the manor, in a tongue that scraped at the edges of sanity. When a group of locals finally gathered the courage to confront Mortivus, they found the house abandoned, no trace of the family, no servants, only rooms filled with strange symbols burned into the walls, and a thick, metallic scent in the air that turned the stomach. Yet the villagers claimed they could still hear footsteps in the corridors at night, and windows that had been boarded up were found open by morning. Some believed the Grimsbanes had left this world entirely. Others whispered they had never left at all, only shifted into a form unseen by who? Man-eyes. The estate was left to decay, but the land around it remained untouched, as if an invisible line marked a boundary no one dared cross. Decades later, a survey team attempting to map the area vanished in the span of a single night. Their equipment later found half buried in the mud, twisted as though crushed by immense force. Those who live in Ravenshade now speak of a shadow that moves across the hills even on cloudless days, and of lights beneath the earth that pulse like a slow, patient heartbeat. And sometimes when the wind is right, the old chants can still be heard, calling out for something or someone to answer. And so, as the years pressed forward like the relentless tide, the Grimsbane name became something spoken only in hushed tones, a whisper carried on the wind through the blackened trees surrounding the old estate. The land itself seemed to have absorbed their cruelty, every root and stone holding the memory of what they had done. Locals swore they had seen shadowy figures moving across the grounds long after midnight, figures that didn't cast shadows themselves, their movements unnatural, jerky, as if marionettes being pulled by unseen strings. The estate's windows, those long, narrow panes of warped glass, reflected no light from the moon, as if they were not windows at all but gateways to something deeper, something that stared back. Inside, dust and time had built layers thick enough to choke, but certain objects remained untouched. An antique mirror still polished to a cruel gleam, a writing desk whose drawers would lock themselves and refuse to open, a grandfather clock whose pendulum swung despite its mechanism being gutted decades ago. It was said that anyone who tried to enter the master bedroom would find themselves unable to breathe, as if invisible hands were wrapped around their throat, squeezing until their vision blurred and their knees buckled. This was no mere haunting. It was a legacy of possession, of the Grimsbane will reaching out from whatever hell they had carved for themselves, ensuring that no one could strip them of their dominion, not even death itself. Scholars who studied the family's history discovered disturbing patterns. Every third generation bore an heir marked by a crescent-shaped scar behind the left ear, a scar present at birth and said to be the sign of the pact. What they had bargained for, no one could say with certainty, but all agreed it was tied to the strange prosperity the family enjoyed in times when the rest of the region said, Arved. The Grimsbanes never planted crops, yet their tables overflowed. They never employed laborers, yet their estates grew larger. It was as if the land itself obeyed them, until it demanded payment. That payment, the whispers claimed, came in the form of disappearances. Entire families would vanish in a single night, their homes left untouched, meals still warm on the table, but no trace of life remaining. And in the Grimsbane vault, hidden beneath the chapel floor, it is said there rests a ledger written in blood, recording each name, each date, each offering that kept the pact alive. And so we come to the most unsettling chapter in the Grimsbane legacy, a chapter whispered in candlelit corridors and recorded in fragments of diaries that were never meant to see the light of day, for it tells of the winter of 1874, when the estate itself seemed to turn against its inhabitants, when the very walls groaned as though burdened by secrets too heavy to bear, and a thick fog descended on the valley for 40 nights without lifting, sealing the manor in a suffocating shroud that blurred the line between the living and the dead. It began when Elias Grimsbane, then the last male heir, returned from an expedition to the Carpathian Mountains carrying a small iron-bound chest he refused to open in public. But the servants swore they heard it rattling faintly as if something inside shifted on its own. Within days of his return, the household descended into chaos. Footsteps in the halls when no one walked them, fires that sputtered out no matter how much coal was fed, and the persistent sound of a woman weeping in the nursery long after the children had been sent away. Elias's sister Margaret wrote in her journal that every mirror in the house began to tarnish from the inside, reflecting warped and shadowy shapes that didn't match the room. One night she awoke to find frost crawling up her walls despite the fire burning in her grate, and in that frost she saw the outline of a face pressed against the inside of the glass, as though the outside world had ceased to exist and the inside had become a prison. Those who tried to leave the estate in those weeks found the main gate rusted shut overnight, while the side paths twisted back toward the house. No matter which direction they took, local villagers avoided the grounds entirely, claiming they saw pale figures pacing along the hedgerows and heard chanting in a language none could name. Elias himself grew thin and fever. Ed, speaking less each day, and when he finally unlocked the chest it was in the dead of night in the library with only a single candle lit. Margaret wrote that she saw him lift out a bundle wrapped in black silk, and when the cloth fell away it revealed a withered hand, perfectly preserved, its long nails curled like hooks. From that night on, Elias was never seen in daylight again, and the fog did not lift until spring, when the manor was found empty, its hearths cold, its windows shattered from the inside, and the chest, now empty, lying in the center of the great hall like an offering to something no one dared to name. But you see, the tragedy of the Grimsbane family didn't merely unfold in grand castles or behind ornate locked doors. It seeped into the streets, into the whispered rumors that passed through taverns and back alleys like a contagion. By the early 19th century, the family's influence had grown so monstrous that no law, no crown, no church dared challenge it. The people spoke of them as one speaks of a storm, inevitable, merciless, and beyond mortal control. Every marriage, every child, every estate they claimed seemed to come with a shadow attached, a quiet disappearance here, a sudden illness there, a fire that destroyed every trace of inconvenient evidence. It was during this period that the family's infamous Red Winter occurred, a season so soaked in dread that locals refused to keep diaries for fear the ink itself might draw their attention. During those months, 4 rival landowners vanished, 2 villages were mysteriously abandoned overnight, and a ship carrying documents that could have exposed the Grimsbanes sank in calm waters under a clear sky. The few survivors swore that in the moments before the ship was swallowed, a cloaked figure stood at the bow, unmoving, as though watching the sea obey some ancient command. By now the family's rituals had become more brazen, their hunger for power mingling with something far older, something occult. It is said that beneath their estate lay a labyrinthine crypt, its walls etched with markings no scholar has ever fully deciphered. Lantern light down there would never behave naturally. It would flicker in patterns, casting shapes that were almost human yet subtly wrong, as if the stone itself was trying to remember faces it had once swallowed. There were whispers of a sealed chamber at the crypt's center, where a table of black marble sat in perpetual cold, untouched by dust, surrounded by 12 high-backed chairs, all empty, yet somehow not. Those who worked in the estate's lower halls claimed to hear faint, deliberate breathing from that direction, even when no living soul was inside. And always, without fail, when one of those whispers escaped into the wider world, the one who spoke them would vanish within a fortnight. The Grimsbane family didn't just control land and wealth, they controlled the very narrative of reality around them, bending it until even the truth forgot itself. And in that suffocating stillness, the Grimsbane family's final mask began to crack. The air inside Blackthorn Hollow thickened with a scent both metallic and sweet, as if blood had mingled with rotting flowers, and each step down the long corridor seemed to echo louder than the last. The wallpaper peeled in curling strips, revealing older layers beneath each one painted with strange symbols that almost pulsed in the flicker of the gas lamps, and when the wind howled outside, the old windows rattled, not in protest but in rhythm, as though answering some ancient and unholy summons. The family portraits lining the walls no longer looked like still oil paintings, but like living faces straining against the canvas, eyes tracking every movement and mouths twitching into knowing smirks. It was here that one could feel the weight of the Grimsbane curse pressing down like an invisible hand on the back of the neck, a reminder that the horrors of this place did not stay bound to history but slithered forward into the present. The old record spoke of a night in 1883 when a gathering was held in the Hollow's grand ballroom, but this was no ordinary celebration. Guests described how the floor vibrated as if something beneath it was trying to rise, the great chandelier swaying though no breeze passed through, and the shadows on the wall no longer matched the guests themselves. They danced and writhed independently like entities that had been waiting centuries to escape. One account claimed that when midnight struck, the music stopped, but the sound of a heartbeat thundered through the entire manor, slow, steady, and inhuman. Some swore it came from the walls themselves. Others whispered that it was the house itself, breathing alive and aware. From that night onward, the Hollow never knew peace. Servants vanished without a trace. Rooms appeared in places where there had been none, and mirrors began to reflect not too soon. He present but fragments of moments yet to happen, most of them terrible in ways that could not be prevented. Every visitor since then carried away an unshakable dread, a sense that they had been marked, watched by something patient enough to wait decades for its due. And as the years wore on, the Grimsbane family grew fewer in number, not because of illness or scandal, but because one by one they seemed to simply disappear, their names etched into the family ledger without a date of death, as though the house had claimed them quietly and without witness. As the years passed, the Grimsbane name seemed to fade from public memory, but those who lived in the nearby villages still spoke of them in hushed tones, stories of strange lights on the estate grounds, of screams carried on the wind during nights when the moon was hidden, of the faint tolling of a bell that no church in the area claimed. All of these whispers fed into the legend, making the family seem less like historical figures and more like an eternal presence in the land itself. Some claimed the last true Grimsbane died decades ago. Others swore they had seen a tall, gaunt man walking the old estate path, his eyes gleaming in the dark like a predator's. Yet no one dared to follow him too closely. The estate itself had long since fallen into ruin, with ivy consuming the walls and the once grand windows now yawning black and empty. But even in its decay there was an unnatural symmetry to the destruction, as if it had been guided by an unseen hand. The furniture inside, though rotting, remained positioned in such a way that any visitor would feel as though they had walked into a room where a meeting had just been adjourned and the participants had simply vanished. The air was heavy there, not just with dust, but with the strange weight of attention, like being watched by something ancient and patient. Occasionally daring souls from the nearby towns would try to spend a night within its walls, usually on a wager or a dare. Most would leave before midnight, their faces pale and their words trembling about something they could not fully describe. Some mentioned hearing footsteps in the upper floors, even though the stairs had long since collapsed. Others spoke of seeing shapes in the mirrors, not their own reflection, but someone standing just behind them, tall and thin, with a faint outline of aristocratic clothing and a mouth that never moved, yet seemed to smile all the same. There was talk of a den chamber deep beneath the estate, a place where the most guarded secrets of the Grimsbane family were locked away. Perhaps quite literally, some believed the family had not simply vanished, but had gone underground in every sense of the word, continuing their gatherings, their rituals, their quiet manipulations of the outside world from the safety of their labyrinthine catacombs below the estate floors. If that was true, then the ruins above were merely the mask concealing the heart that still beat in darkness. The deeper we delve into the Grimsbane legacy, the more we realize that every stone of their ancestral estate holds the weight of calculated cruelty. The halls themselves seem to hum with a residual energy left behind by centuries of manipulation, deceit, and blood pacts with forces beyond human comprehension. It is here within these walls that the family refined their most insidious art. Not just the accumulation of wealth or influence, but the shaping of reality itself through symbols, rituals, and psychological warfare. Each generation was trained from childhood to see the world not as a collection of facts, but as a malleable stage where truth could be rewritten powerfully enough to bind entire populations to an illusion. The Grimsbane patriarchs were not content with simple dominance. They wanted permanence. They wanted to weave their will so deeply into the fabric of culture and governance that it could no longer be distinguished from reality itself, and so they embedded themselves into every institution, from royal courts to secret councils, from merchant guilds to underground sects, each placement carefully calculated, each move serving a greater design. But their control was not brute force. It was subtler, more sinister. It operated in whispers, in coded texts, in art that concealed forbidden knowledge in plain sight, while their rivals wasted resources on wars. The Grimsbanes reshaped laws, rewrote traditions, and even manipulated religious doctrine to ensure their mythos became indistinguishable from divine truth, and all the while they kept the true source of their power hidden in a chamber deep beneath the estate, a chamber no outsider had seen and lived to describe. Within this chamber, it is said they kept relics that should not exist, relics that bent time, space, and perception itself, and through them they communed with something ancient, something that fed them secrets in exchange for offerings no one dares to define. Over the centuries, these offerings grew darker, more costly, until even the most loyal family members began to question what they had bound themselves to, but by then it was far too late. The Grimsbane name had already become a shadow that moved through empires and revolutions, unscathed, their influence so deeply rooted that removing them would mean tearing apart the very structure of the world as it was known, and perhaps that was their ultimate safeguard, to become so necessary to the system that their survival was the survival of the order itself. And in that silence you could almost hear the house thinking, as if the wood and stone themselves held memories too heavy to speak aloud. The flickering light from a single oil lamp danced across the cracked plaster walls, painting them in restless shadows that shifted like specters when the wind slipped through the warped window frames outside. The air had thickened with a strange static, as though the night itself was listening. The family archives lay open on the long oak table, their brittle pages smelling faintly of dust and something more metallic, perhaps the scent of old ink, or perhaps the faint ghost of blood. In the careful handwriting were dates, places, and names, many of them crossed out in heavy strokes as if someone had tried to erase them from existence entirely. Yet the more you stared, the more those names seemed to return, barely visible beneath the ink, like the paper itself refused to forget. A strange pattern emerged, births and deaths falling in uncanny symmetry, as though the family's bloodline was a ledger balanced by some unseen hand. The deeper you went, the more the stories darkened, whispering of unspoken bargains and quiet disappearances, not explained by war or disease, but by something older, something that seemed to claim a life every time another was given. It was here that the reality settled like frost across your bones. This wasn't simply history, it was currency. The Grimsbane family had been paying a debt across generations, a debt written in flesh and memory. The exact nature of the bargain was never stated outright, but in the margins of the oldest book, in a faded hand, was a single repeated phrase: "What is taken must be given, what is given must be taken." No signature, only the date, 1643, the year the family first took root in the land where the manor now stood. The air in the room seemed heavier now, as though each word you read added another invisible weight. Sing down on your shoulders. In the corner of your vision, something seemed to shift just outside the reach of the lamplight. When you turned, there was nothing but that persistent sense of being watched, as if the house itself had leaned closer, eager to see how much you understood, and whether you might yet become part of its account. And so the whispered curse of the Grimsbane family seemed to thicken like fog, settling into every corridor of their sprawling estate and into every generation that bore the name. Outsiders claimed it was superstition, a convenient explanation for a lineage marred by tragedy, but the locals swore otherwise. They spoke in low tones of a pact sealed in blood centuries ago, one that bound the Grimsbanes to a power that demanded loyalty in exchange for influence and wealth. As the years passed, the wealth waned, but the influence persisted, like a shadow that grew longer at dusk, impossible to outrun. In the great hall, portraits of stern-faced ancestors seemed to watch, their eyes heavy with unspoken warnings. The floorboards creaked underfoot as though the house itself was alive, breathing with the stories it refused to release. Each successor to the family seat grew more secretive than the last, withdrawing from society, building walls not just of stone but of silence. Rumors of hidden rooms beneath the estate circulated among the villagers, places where rituals were held, lit only by flickering candles and the glint of ceremonial blades. Those who worked in the manor, maids, groundskeepers, kitchen hands, never stayed long. They left pale and hollow-eyed, claiming they could no longer endure the strange noises at night, the whispers that came from nowhere and everywhere, the sense of being watched even in their sleep. The last remaining heir, Elias Grimsbane, inherited both the crumbling house and its dark legacy. He was rarely seen in daylight, preferring the hours when the rest of the world slept. Lantern light could sometimes be spotted moving through the windows long past midnight, as if he were pacing, searching for something, or perhaps being hunted by something within his own walls. Old villagers insisted that the curse had reached its final cycle, that Elias was the last link in the chain, and when he was gone, the Grimsbane line would vanish along with the protection or the torment that had kept them bound. But there were others who believed the opposite, that the end of the bloodline would unleash whatever force the family had kept contained for generations. And so the estate waited, as it had always waited, a brooding presence on the hilltop, the wind carrying the faintest sound of chanting on moonless nights, and the eyes in the portraits holding their eternal, suffocating gaze. And so the Grimsbane estate, now weathered by centuries of shadows, stood as both monument and warning, its cracked stones and creeping ivy seeming to pulse with the memories of every oath broken and every secret buried within its walls. For the family's history was not merely recorded in ink or parchment, but etched into the very air, a miasma of whispered threats and half-forgotten tragedies that lingered long after the participants had turned to dust, and those who dared to step inside reported feeling an almost physical weight upon their chests, as if unseen hands were pressing down, urging them to leave while they still could. Yet something always drew them deeper, into halls lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow with quiet judgment, each ancestor a fragment of a much darker whole, their gazes heavy with knowledge no living soul should bear. For the Grimsbanes had mastered the art of survival not through wealth alone, but by binding themselves to forces older than any crown or church, forces that demanded loyalty in blood, bone and silence. And it was said that deep beneath the estate, in chambers no map recorded, rituals were performed that bent the will of men and blurred the line between the living and the dead, granting the family power beyond mortal measure, but at a cost no sane person would dare to pay, a cost that, over generations, left them both untouchable and cursed, feared by rivals yet envied for their reach. And even now, in an age that scoffs at such notions, their influence could be traced in political shifts, sudden fortunes, and the quiet erasure of those who stood in their way. For the Grimsbanes had learned to weave themselves into the fabric of history so subtly that removing them would unravel everything around them, and though the name might not be spoken in public halls or polite gatherings, in dimly lit rooms where real power moved unseen, it was uttered with a mixture of dread and respect, as if invoking it might draw their attention, for to be noticed by the Grimsbanes was to be marked, and to be marked was to be drawn sooner or later into their game. A game with no rules but one. The family always wins, no matter the sacrifice, and those who thought themselves clever enough to outmaneuver them often vanished without a trace, their fates sealed in the same breath that dared to challenge the bloodline's claim to dominion. The villagers still whispered of the night when the lights in the old Grimsbane chapel burned long after midnight, their pale glow spilling through the cracked stained glass like the eyes of something half awake, half dreaming. That evening was said to be the last time anyone saw all 6 members of the family together. They entered in silence, their black coats slick with rain, faces drawn and severe, and though the storm outside screamed against the walls, the chapel was so still it seemed the air itself was holding its breath. There were no prayers, no hymns, only the muffled sound of boots on stone and the faint rustle of papers as Lord Elias Grimsbane placed an unmarked book upon the altar. Those who dared peek through the warped doors swore the book was bound in something not leather, but skin pale and taut as if taken from some nameless place. They said Elias spoke in a language older than the soil underfoot, and the words seemed to bend the air around him. His children knelt, eyes closed, lips moving in unison as though they had been rehearsing for this moment their entire lives. The youngest sister, Lucille, only 12, trembled but kept her voice steady, her small hands clutching a candle so tightly the wax melted into her skin without a flinch. The smell of it mingled with something metallic, sharp and cold, that made the watchers turn away, unable to bear the sight. Then, at the exact strike of midnight, the chapel's ancient bell rang, though no one had pulled the rope. A sound deep and slow, reverberating through the bones of the village windows. Rattled animals bolted into the woods, and the air thickened until breathing felt like swallowing water. When the bell's echo died, the lights went out, the rain stopped, and the door swung open without a hand upon it. The Grimsbanes walked out one by one, their faces empty of all expression, their eyes reflecting nothing and no one. The book was gone, and so was the candle in Lucille's hands. They said the air was colder after that, colder in a way that seeped into the soul. The next morning, every mirror in the village was found cracked straight through the center, and not a bird sang for 3 full days. The disappearance of the Grimsbane family marked not just an end, but the beginning of a dark chapter that would haunt the village for generations. The authorities who arrived found only echoes and shadows, the chapel stripped bare as if some invisible force had swept clean any trace of ritual or resistance. Whispers grew into legends of curses and pacts made in blood and silence. The villagers avoided the place at night, and the fields where the children once played seemed to grow twisted under the weight of unseen sorrow. Decades later, those who dared to investigate spoke of a presence that watched from the woods, cold and unforgiving, a force born of greed, fear and betrayal that thrived in the silence imposed by those who refused to see that evil does not always wear the mask of a monster, but often hides behind the veil of faith and trust. The tale of the Grimsbane family is a grim reminder that darkness can flourish where vigilance dies, and that the most terrifying conspiracies are not those of strangers but those nurtured within the sanctuaries meant to protect us when the doors to the chapel closed. That night they did not just seal a room, but the fate of innocent souls lost to a conspiracy so vast, so methodical, that it defies comprehension, and yet it is a truth as real as the cold wind that now sweeps through the empty pews. Remember this story, for it is not merely history, but a warning, a call to see beyond the comforting lies and confront the shadows lurking in the places we believe are safe, because only by facing these truths can we hope to prevent history from repeating itself in darkness forever. If this story shook you to your core, don't stay silent. Share it with someone who seeks the hidden truths. Hit that like button to fuel the search for forgotten shadows. Subscribe to History's Dark Mirror and join the few brave enough to peer behind the veil. Stay vigilant, because some secrets demand to be seen.